Modern games didn't suddenly just get worse, right? We didn't lose technology over time. The developers didn't lose talent. The games got safer. And safe design teaches players how not to care about a game. Now, that sounds a little harsh, but it explains almost everything that feels off about modern gaming. Here's what changed and how players noticed. The feeling players can't really explain. If you've played games for a while, I mean, you can already feel this, even if you can't put it into your own words, right? The modern game looks absolutely incredible. They're massive, super polished games. They run super smooth, and now we can get 60 frames on consoles. And it was nothing like that we had 10 to 15 years ago. But yet they don't stick. You finish your games quicker, you forget about them quicker. Moments that should feel tense or meaningful dissolve almost immediately. You move on not because you're satisfied, but because there's literally nothing left to hold on to. That's not how you make nostalgia. It's also just it's pattern recognition. So, what players are actually experiencing with modern games can explain themselves constantly. They warn you before you have failure. They cushion your consequences. They also interrupt discovery with instruction. There's just too many tutorials that are constantly coming in your way rather than you just learning how to play the game. You're told where to go, you're told why this matters, you're told how to feel about what just happened rather than letting it play out how it should. So failure is no longer teaching, it is inconveniencing. And when failure stops teaching, mastery stops meaning anything. When everything is reversible, nothing feels earned. Now, older games didn't ask if failure felt fair. They just assumed that failure was part of the lesson you're going to learn, right? You failed, you adjusted how you needed to, and then you would try again. That loop would create tension and memory and investment over time. Modern games often remove that loop entirely, right? Checkpoints appear instantly, they're more frequent. Systems correct mistakes automatically. Loss is pretty much framed as a temporary friction without consequence. And when loss doesn't matter, victory doesn't either. Now, what changed the direction? All right. This shift didn't happen because developers forgot how to design. That's not true at all. It happened because the stakes exploded. And that is a huge problem, right? Budgets grew out of proportion. Teams ballooned to just massive size. Audiences widened. And a single project now involved usually, a handful of people is involving hundreds or even thousands of people. And at that scale, uncertainty becomes dangerous, right? The failure isn't about education anymore on your part. It's catastrophic. And when failure isn't allowed, the risk disappears. Now, from design to risk management, design quietly stopped asking what's interesting, what's memorable, and what will challenge the players who are going to buy this game. And they decided to start asking, well, what won't frustrate a player? What won't upset them? And what won't cause backlash? Right? Let's put all this woke crap in there. Let's make sure it's super easy to play. You have all sorts of levels to make sure you're feeling comfortable. Right? The goal shifted from an experience to risk mitigation. And that's from trusting players to just managing reactions. That change was subtle over time, but has become permanent. Now, there are, over time, a lot of games, even today, that take risks, and that's awesome. And I hope it never stops. So, some of the games that rejected that shift completely and still doing it to this day is the Dark Souls series. All of them. They refuse to explain themselves. Their entire concept is punishment through failure relentlessly. Right? They'd even coined the term get good. That's really what it was. It was basically an old school thought process, which they never got rid of. That's how FromSoft has built every game. Right? It trusted its players to learn through the pain of losing, right? There's no warnings, there's no safety nets, and there's no apology for the difficulty. And because of that, every victory felt real. It felt you earned something. Another game is Fallout New Vegas. That allowed permanent consequences, right? The entire quest line that you wanted or you thought about you wanted to do vanished completely on one single decision, right? You couldn't see everything. You couldn't be everyone. You couldn't see how every storyline would close. You have to pick and live with what you chose. Another game that back in the day took a risk, you could say, was any 2D to any 3D game. But a perfect example was Metroid Prime. When that game came out, there was a lot of questions. Well, is it going to be good? Because most games who jumped from 2D to 3D don't exactly have that, well, good of a track record. But that risk paid off. And that was the benefit of taking these kinds of risks. The game didn't exceed in spite of that risk, right? They succeeded because of that risk. So, what does risk actually do, right? Risk creates identity. It gives games edges, boundaries, and personality that are separate from every other idea and every other game that's out there. Right? Risk creates moments that players remember years later. Safe design creates content players forget almost instantly, guaranteed weeks later. Risk asks players to meet the game halfway, right? Safety asks for literally nothing. And every gamer feels that. Now, there's also a lot of games that have played it safe over the years. We can easily talk about. Other games moved in the opposite direction, right? This is what they did. Mechanics became super simplified. Everything is the same as every other game in that genre because that's just like, all right, we'll make sure that everybody can understand this. We'll get a wide range of everyone who wants to be able to play these games, right? Because of that, the systems flattened and failure became cosmetic. Difficulty existed in the menu, but not in practice. Tutorials expanded literally across the entire game. It wasn't just like a little bit right in the beginning of the game. It became the whole game. Pop-ups replaced discovery. One of the best things you could do in an open world game. Find something, discover it on your own. That's a little reward for yourself, right? Systems corrected players before mistakes could settle. Nothing was allowed to really surprise you. Nothing was allowed to challenge for too long. The goal wasn't immersion anymore. It was player reassurance. So designing by caution is really what it comes down to. Anything sharp gets sanded down, right? We don't want to take too big of a step. It's too risky, too problematic, too not inclusive of everyone, which is absurdly ridiculous. Anything comfortable would get removed, right? Your moral ambiguity becomes optional. Failure becomes reversible. Choices are cosmetic. And when discomfort disappears, tension disappears. When tension disappears, immersion collapses. You'll be playing a game and you'll be focused on whatever's going on, not really in that moment. A game cannot feel real if it's afraid of its player. Now, this isn't just about politics. Obviously, politics in video games recently, in the last few decades, has exploded and has changed the entire dynamic of everything. But it's also about incentives, right? When failure becomes expensive, creativity becomes dangerous. So that leads to more safe mechanics, more safe stories, more safe outcomes. Safe doesn't mean better. It means forgettable. So A player doesn't want that. A player doesn't want perfection, though. They want meaning. They want tension. They want to understand the struggle and recovery of these characters that were designed and thought up without any kind of political agenda or ideology, except what is in that story, right? They want to also fail. They want to know that it mattered, and they want games that respect them enough to trust them. Now, the shift didn't happen by accident. Developers repeated the same decisions across multiple studios, across multiple genres. Over time, those decisions became patterns, and those patterns taught players what to expect, and we just let it happen. They learned that when choice was cosmetic, when difficulty existed only in theory, and when failure was framed as growth, then it was quietly removed. It wasn't malicious. It was very cautious. But caution in any game that's being designed can accumulate. And once players recognize the language of safe design, immersion collapses on itself. Because these outcomes weren't forced, they were chosen, giving you an illusion of choice. Over and over, developers chose safety instead of commitment. They chose reassurance instead of respect. And all gamers noticed. Safe design teaches players how not to care. This is the CyberDan experiment.